The name to part 3 of 4. The unconscious has, as such, its status as something that, by position and structure, cannot pierce through into the level where it is susceptible to a pre-conscious verbalization. And yet, we are told, this unconscious, at every moment, makes an effort, pushes in the direction of making itself known. Assuredly, and for good reason, as it is at home, as it were, in a universe structured by discourse. Here, the passage of the unconscious towards the preconscious is, you might say, just a normal kind of effect of the irradiation from what goes round in the constitution of the unconscious as such, of that which, in the unconscious, keeps present the primary and radical function of the formulation of the subject as speaking subject. What you have to see is that the would-be sequence of unconscious to preconscious, then arriving at consciousness, should not be accepted without revision, and that it can be said in a certain way, insofar as we have to admit that what is defined as preconscious, as being in circulation in the world, in real circulation, we have to conceptualize that what happens at the level of the preconscious is something that we have to read in the same way, with the same structure, which is the one that I tried to give you a sense of at this root point, where something comes and brings to language what can be called its ultimate enforcement, the reading of the sign. At the existing level of the life of the constituted subject, of a subject that has emerged over the course of a long cultural history, what happens is, for the subject, a reading outside of the ambient context, from the factual presence of language in the real, and at the level of consciousness, this level that for Freud always seemed to pose a problem. He never stopped pointing out that it was definitely something to be clarified in the future, to be articulated in a more precise way than in relation to its economic function, the level at which he described it to us at the beginning. Let's remember how he described it to us as this protective layer that he designates with the term phi. It is above all something that, for him, is comparable with the membrane covering the sensory organs, i.e. with something that is essentially a filter, that encloses, that selects, that only retains this qualitative clue which we can demonstrate to be a function that is homologous to this clue about reality, that precisely allows us to taste the state we are in, just enough to be sure that we are not dreaming, if it is a question of something analogous. What we see is truly of the visible. Likewise, consciousness, in relation to what constitutes the preconscious and makes for us this world that is tightly woven together by our thoughts, consciousness is the surface by which the perception of this something that is at the heart of the subject receives, if I may say so, its own thoughts, its own discourse from the outside. Consciousness is there so that the unconscious, if I may say so, actually rather refuses what comes to it from the preconscious, or chooses therein, in the strictest way, what it needs for its own good offices. And what is that? It is precisely here that we encounter this paradox that I have called the intersection of systemic functions. At the first level, so essential to acknowledge of the Freudian articulation, the unconscious is represented to you by him as a flux, like a world, like a chain of thoughts. No doubt, consciousness is also made up by the coherence of perceptions, the testing of reality. It is the articulation between perceptions in an organized world. Inversely, what we find in the unconscious is this significant repetition that brings us from something that we call thoughts, Gedanken, that are very well formed, Freud says, to a concatenation of thoughts that are beyond our own grasp. And yet, what is Freud himself going to tell us? What is the subject looking for at each level of both of these systems? That at the level of the preconscious, what we are looking for is, correctly speaking, the identicalness, the oneness of the thinking. It is what has been elaborated by this whole chapter of epistemology since Plato, our attempt to organize the world, the attempt at logic, which is, correctly speaking, an attempt to reduce diversity to something that is all the same, identical. It is to identify thought by thought, proposition by proposition, in diversely articulated relationships that form the very weft of what is called formal logic. Something which poses, for those who think of the scientific edifice in an extremely ideal way, as being able to be and having to be, at least in a virtual sense, already complete. Something which poses the problem of knowing whether the whole of science, the whole of knowledge, every attempt to grasp what is going on in the world in a methodical and articulated way, must not, in the end, lead to a tautology. It is not for nothing that you have heard me evoke the problem of tautology on several occasions. And we would have no way of knowing how to end our discourse this year if we don't bring in a definitive judgment of it. Hence the world, this world of which the reality function is linked to the perceptual function, is also that in which we can only make progress in our knowledge of it by way of identifying the thoughts. This is not at all a paradox for us, but what is paradoxical is to read in Freud's text that what the unconscious is seeking, what it wants, if we can put it like that what is at the root of its functioning, of its coming into play, is the perception's identity, i.e., that this would literally make no sense if what it is a question of was not the following: that the relationship between the unconscious and what it is seeking in its own mode of recurrence is precisely that which, having once been perceived, is what is identifiably identical, if I may say so. It is the perception of that time there. It is this putting a ring on the finger of it, that time there, with the hallmark of that time there. And it is precisely this that will always be missing. It's that at every other kind of reappearance of what responds to the original signifier, being the point at which the mark of the subject was in receipt of it, whatever it was, which is at the origin of the overdrankt, the primal repressed, it will always be missing in relation to whatever comes along to represent it. This mark that is the unique mark of the original upsurge of an original signifier, which happened once at the moment when the point, the something of the overdrankt in question, happened into unconscious existence. Something that keeps happening to this internal order that is the unconscious, between, on the one hand, what it receives from the exterior world and here, where it has things to link together, and from the fact of linking them in a signifying form, where it can only receive them in their difference. And this is why it cannot in any way be satisfied by this search, as such, for the identity of perceptions, even if this is what gives it its property as unconscious. This gives us the triad conscious, unconscious, preconscious in a slightly modified order, and in a certain way that justifies the formula that I once already tried to give you of the unconscious, by saying to you that it was between perception and consciousness, under the skin, as one says. It is very much here that, once we have suggested it, something indicates that we should look into this point that I started to go into by formulating things on the basis of experimental philosophical research into the subject as it exists in Descartes, insofar as it is strictly different to anything that can have been done in any other moment of philosophical reflection, provided that it is indeed the subject that questions her himself, that searches for being as such. The subject, insofar as he goes to the heart of his proposition, that what is questioned is not about what is real and what is appearance, the relationship between what exists and what does not exist, of what remains and what runs off, but of knowing whether one can trust the other, whether, as such, what the subject receives from the exterior is a reliable sign. The "I think, therefore I am," I pulverized it sufficiently in front of you for you to be able to see now how the problem presents itself more or less. This "I think," of which we haven't strictly speaking said that it was a nonsense, and this is what gives it its worth, of course it makes no more sense than "I am lying," but from the moment that it gets articulated, it can but behold itself as "therefore I am." This is not the resulting conclusion that it draws from it, but it's that it can but do thinking from the moment that it truly begins to think, i.e., that it is insofar as this impossible "I think" turns into something that is in the order of the pre-conscious, that it connotes as a signified, and not as a result, as ontological determination, that it connotes as a signified that this "I think" leads to a ... I am, that henceforth is nothing but the X of this subject that we are searching for, i.e. of that which there is at the beginning, in order for the identification of this "I think" to be able to be produced. Notice that this continues, and so on and so forth. If I think that I am, I no longer need to be ironic to think that I have to be a pense-être, a think being, or an être pensant, a being thinking. The "I think" that acts as the denominator here sees the same duplicity reproducing itself very easily, i.e. that I have to perceive myself thinking that I think, as this "I think" which is at the limits of my thinking about my thinking, is itself an "I think" that reproduces the "I think, therefore I am." An "I am" coming from an "I think" over an "I am" that is also coming from an "I think," and again over another "I am" which can also be seen as coming from an "I think." Does this go on ad infinitum? Certainly not. It is also one of the most common modes of philosophical thought experiments, when one has begun to establish such and such a formula, to test whether what one has herein been able to hold on to of actual experience is in some way identifiably multipliable, as in a game of mirrors. There is a little exercise, which is the one that I made up once, my own little sophism, the assertion of anticipated certainty, one in relation to the game of discs, where it is by spotting what the other two do that a subject must deduce the mark even or odd which he himself has been assigned with on his back, i.e. something that is very close to what it is about here. It is easy to see by thinking through this game that far from the hesitation, which it is in effect completely possible to see being produced, for if I see the others deciding too quickly, making the same decision that I want to make, i.e. that I am, like them, marked with a disc of the same colour, if I see them drawing their conclusion too quickly, I will precisely draw from it the conclusion. If this happens, I can see some hesitation emerging in me, i.e. that if they have seen so quickly what they are, it's that, in locating myself, I am myself distinct enough from them, for, logically speaking, they have to go through the same process of reflection. We will also see them oscillating and saying to themselves, "Let's look at this again," i.e. that all three subjects involved will hesitate together, and it can easily be shown that it is effectively only after three hesitating oscillations that they can really have, and will certainly, and in some way fully, have figured out, by scanning the rhythm of their hesitations, the limits of all the contradictory possibilities.